In 1985, the UK witnessed one of its most notorious true crime cases, the White House farm murders. 5 members of the Bamber family were discovered dead in a single night. While the case appeared to be a straightforward murder-suicide, questions remain about whether it was truly a massacre with the killer escaping into the night. Although the case is officially solved, with a verdict in place, many in the country believe that the decision may have been wrong. Many people believe this case could represent one of the most significant miscarriages of justice in the country's history. Today, we're going to delve into the White House farm murders. Before we dive into the case, I want to give a disclaimer. I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone mentioned in this video. This video is intended for educational purposes only, and everything I discuss is based on information I've found online and compiled into a video. A couple of content warnings before we dive into this case. There will be discussions of mental illness, specifically schizophrenia, as well as references to hospitalization and suicide. If these topics are triggering for you, I encourage you to click away from this video now. I believe those are all the necessary content warnings for this case. Hopefully, I'll have the chance to see you again with a different case. But with that said, let's get into today's case. The events of today's case took place in Essex, South England, on the night of August 6, 1985, or rather in the early hours of the next morning. At around 3:30 a.m., the police received a frantic phone call from a man named Jeremy Bamber. Jeremy expressed concern for his father's safety, explaining that he had just spoken with his father on the phone. His father was in a panic, saying that Jeremy's sister had gone mad with a gun and was chasing everyone around the house. Jeremy then heard gunshots on the other end of the line before the call abruptly ended. Fearing that his sister might have just killed his father, Jeremy asked the police to meet him at his family's home, White House Farm. Jeremy hung up the phone and both he and the police headed to the farm. Interestingly, the police arrived before Jeremy did. When they got there, the scene was eerily quiet. The police circled the house, checking for any signs of forced entry or unlocked windows and doors. Everything was locked, except for one ground floor window, which was unlocked. This window provided the police with their entry point into White House Farm that night. Once inside, they were met with a horrific sight, a complete bloodbath. Not only had Jeremy's father been shot and killed, but the entire family had been brutally murdered. The first body the police discovered was that of Jeremy's father, 61-year-old Neville Bamber. He was the only one found on the ground floor. Neville had been beaten and shot 8 times, with 6 of those shots hitting him in the face. His body also showed defensive wounds all over his arms, indicating that he had fought fiercely against his attacker, desperately trying to save his life. As the police made their way upstairs, they found the second body, Jeremy's mother, 61-year-old June Bamber. She was lying dead in the hallway. June had been shot once at point-blank range, a single fatal shot that ended her life. In one of the bedrooms, police found the bodies of 2 young boys, Jeremy's 6-year-old nephews, Daniel and Nicholas Caffel, his sister's sons. The boys had been staying with their grandparents at White House Farm. Both children had been shot and killed, with 8 gunshot wounds between them. It appeared that they had been shot while sleeping, as their bodies were found still cuddled up in bed. Finally, in the main bedroom of the house, police discovered the body of Sheila Caffel, Jeremy's sister, who had allegedly gone mad and killed everyone. She was found dead on the floor of the bedroom. Sheila was found with a rifle still in her hands, and it looked like she had shot herself twice in the throat. In her other hand, she was holding a Bible. It was an incredibly harrowing scene for the police to walk in on. But to them, it seemed obvious what had happened. Since Sheila was holding the gun, they quickly classified this as a tragic murder-suicide. Jeremy Bamber, the only surviving member of the family, was supposedly devastated. While the police searched the house, he waited outside, crying and being comforted by the officers. They gave him whiskey and cups of tea to help calm him down. After all, he had just lost his entire family in one night. His whole world had been turned upside down, and now he was alone, with no close family left. The following morning, when the sun came up, the police did another sweep of the house to double-check their theory that it was a murder-suicide. They didn't find anything unusual, confirming their initial thoughts. Since the house wasn't considered a crime scene, it was quickly emptied. All the bodies were taken to the morgue, where they would be held until their funerals could be arranged. The house was then handed back to Jeremy Bamber, the only surviving member of the family. The entire village was shocked and heartbroken to hear about the massacre. The Bamber family was well loved and respected by everyone. They had been a part of the community for many years and were regular churchgoers. June Bamber, in particular, was deeply involved in the church and the community. She was always doing things for the town, and everyone admired her. Because of her, people also held her husband, children, and the entire family in high regard. They were a beloved family, and no one could have imagined something like this happening. The tragedy was made even worse by the fact that the family had been killed by their own daughter or mother. It was incredibly upsetting, and people were devastated for both the family and Sheila, whose mental illness had seemingly driven her to this point. Jeremy mentioned that his sister Sheila had struggled greatly with mental illness throughout her life. She had been in and out of mental hospitals throughout her teenage years and never really found peace in her mind. Along with being generally mentally ill since childhood, Sheila faced many difficulties as she grew up. She struggled with cocaine addiction for a while but managed to quit. She went through several miscarriages, had a cheating husband, and dealt with her ongoing mental illness, which caused her to have meltdowns and manic episodes. Eventually, she was hospitalized and diagnosed with schizophrenia. The last time Sheila was admitted to the hospital was just 5 months before the shooting. While she was there, she told the hospital staff that she was communicating with God. It was also well known that Sheila had a troubled relationship with her mother, June. So there could be some slight motive there if she was already suicidal. Perhaps that troubled relationship contributed to the violent aspect of her behavior. Sheila and her mother, June, had not gotten along well since Sheila was young, and their conflicts intensified when Sheila became a teenager. As Sheila grew into a young woman and started dating and seeing boys, her very religious mother, June, strongly disapproved. One time, June caught Sheila sunbathing naked with a boy. Although they were likely just sunbathing, June reacted explosively, calling Sheila the devil's child. This incident caused a significant rift in their relationship, and June's dislike for Sheila deepened. The police later concluded that a mix of long-held resentment and hatred towards her mother, combined with Sheila's severe mental illness, might have led to the tragic events. Plus a particularly severe schizophrenic episode that led Sheila Caffel to want to murder her whole family. And then kill herself afterwards. In the week following the tragedy, Jeremy Bamber and his extended family, uncles, aunts, cousins, and others, gathered at White House Farm to plan the funerals. It struck me as odd that they chose the scene of the crime for this purpose. While it might have been the most convenient location with ample parking for everyone, there's something unsettling about planning funerals in a place where such horrific events occurred. Despite its eerie nature, the house had been in their family for generations, so they weren't going to demolish it. To make it more bearable, the house had been cleaned, all carpets, linens, and curtains with blood on them had been removed and burned. This meant the house was clean, but the decision to hold the funeral planning there still seemed deeply unsettling. They believed there was no evidence of the murders or the suicide left in the house, until Jeremy's cousin David found something suspicious. While rummaging through boxes under the stairs, he discovered a silencer, an accessory used to muffle gunshots. Upon closer inspection, David noticed a speck of blood on the end of the silencer. Concerned, he secretly handed it over to the police, informing them that he had found it in a box at White House Farm and that he was unsure why it was there or whose blood it was. The police took the silencer and ran tests on the blood sample. Since this case took place in the mid-1980s, lab technology wasn't as advanced as it is today. They couldn't identify an exact DNA match, but they could determine the blood type, such as AB or A negative. Through their testing, they discovered that the blood on the silencer was type A. This finding was particularly significant because, out of all the bodies found in the house that night, only one had type A blood. The blood on the silencer matched Sheila's, which completely upended the investigation. If Sheila was the last to die, having shot herself in the bedroom, how could her blood have ended up on something found downstairs? This raised serious questions. How could the silencer have ended up there if she supposedly died upstairs? This discovery suggested that the case might not have been a murder-suicide after all. Perhaps Sheila didn't kill herself. Instead, someone might have shot her with the silencer attached, then removed it before placing the gun next to her to make it look like she had committed suicide. This new evidence opened up the possibility that Sheila had been framed. And then the person who removed the silencer likely hid it under the stairs, which seemed to be the only plausible explanation. With this new twist in the investigation, the police decided to re-examine all the evidence they had, but there wasn't much to work with. Initially, they believed it was a straightforward murder-suicide case, so they didn't suspect foul play and hadn't collected much evidence from the scene. Although the scene was technically a crime scene with 4 murders, the police didn't treat it as such because they assumed Sheila was the perpetrator who had taken her own life. As a result, they didn't gather much evidence. However, they did take crime scene photos at the time, and these photos became crucial when they reviewed the case. As they revisited the photos, they noticed something very interesting about the images of Sheila's body. It's important to remember that the house was a complete bloodbath, as I mentioned before, and these photos revealed details that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. In the crime scene photos of Sheila's body, there was blood everywhere, on the floors, walls, and furniture. However, what stood out was that the bottoms of Sheila's feet were completely clean. There was no blood on them, which indicated that she hadn't been walking around the house or standing in the blood. This strongly suggested that Sheila couldn't have been the one rampaging through the house, shooting everyone, because if she had, there would have been blood on her feet. This pointed to the possibility that she was shot in place, fell, and died there without moving. Moreover, the police realized it would have been physically impossible for Sheila to have shot herself with the rifle while the silencer was attached. Sheila was a small, petite woman, and the rifle, with the silencer on, would have been too long for her to reach the trigger with her fingers. However, the blood splatter on the silencer indicated that it was attached when she was shot. This further supported the idea that Sheila didn't shoot herself, but was instead shot by someone else. Yes, I see where you're coming from. The gun was found without the silencer attached when Sheila's body was discovered. The theory is that someone might have killed her with the silencer on, but when they went to plant the gun on her to make it look like a suicide, they realized that with the silencer attached, the gun was too long for Sheila to have feasibly shot herself. So, they removed the silencer and hid it, making the gun shorter and giving the appearance that Sheila could have killed herself with it. Now, considering Sheila's injuries, she had 2 bullet wounds to her neck. This is significant because it's highly unlikely that someone would be able to shoot themselves twice in the neck, especially with a rifle. The presence of 2 gunshot wounds further supports the theory that Sheila didn't kill herself but was instead murdered and then staged to look like a suicide. Exactly. It's very rare for someone to be able to shoot themselves twice when committing suicide, especially in the neck or throat area. While it's physically possible, it's highly unlikely. Typically, 1 shot is enough to cause fatal damage, particularly in such a sensitive area. The fact that Sheila had 2 bullet wounds in her neck further raised suspicions. Even without the silencer, the rifle was still quite long, and it would have required careful positioning for Sheila to shoot herself. After the first shot, the gun would likely have been jolted out of place, making a second self-inflicted shot even more improbable. Additionally, after the first shot, Sheila would have been severely injured and bleeding out, making it extremely difficult for her to line up the rifle again for a second shot. This adds to the evidence that Sheila likely didn't shoot herself, but was instead shot by someone else who then staged the scene to look like a suicide. Exactly. The idea that Sheila could have shot herself twice, especially with such a long rifle, seemed highly improbable to the police. The new evidence increasingly pointed to Sheila being a victim herself, murdered and then framed for the killings of her family. But who would do such a thing? Rumors had already been circulating in the town about Jeremy Bamber, the Bamber family's son. It was widely known that Jeremy stood to inherit a significant fortune from his parents when they passed away. This inheritance included not only the large White House farm manor but also the 300 acres of land that came with it, a valuable estate that had been in the family for generations. Given this potential motive, suspicion began to shift toward Jeremy. If he were responsible, framing Sheila for the murders would ensure he inherited everything while avoiding blame. The whispers about Jeremy's involvement started to gain more credibility as the investigation continued. Jeremy was well aware that the inheritance would one day be his, or his sister's. His parents owned more than just White House Farm Manor, they also had an apartment in London that they rented out, which generated a steady income. Jeremy stood to inherit a substantial amount of property and money from his parents when they passed away. However, he would have had to share this inheritance with his sister Sheila and likely her 2 sons as well. This meant the wealth would be divided 4 ways, significantly reducing what he would receive. The theory is that Jeremy wasn't happy with the idea of splitting the inheritance. He wanted it all for himself. To achieve this, he allegedly decided to eliminate everyone in one night, both his parents, so he could inherit everything, and Sheila and her sons, to ensure no one else had a claim to the fortune. By removing all potential heirs, Jeremy would be the sole beneficiary of the entire estate. Despite the growing suspicions and the theory that Jeremy Bamber might have orchestrated the murders to inherit his family's wealth, there was no concrete evidence at that time, just the police's suspicion. The turning point in the investigation was the realization that Jeremy's phone call to the police on the night of the murders didn't align with the evidence. He had claimed that his father was worried because Sheila was supposedly running around the house with a gun, but the police had since determined that this wasn't true. This raised the question, had Jeremy lied during that call? Though suspicions against Jeremy were intensifying, nothing was done immediately. By the time of the funeral on August 16, 1985, for all 5 victims, the investigation hadn't yet moved forward. However, due to the rumors and suspicions circulating in the town, all eyes were on Jeremy during the funeral. People noticed his behavior, and it struck them as odd. At times, when he thought no one was watching, Jeremy was seen grinning to himself. He was also accused of exaggerating his grief for the cameras outside the funeral. Observers noted that while he would appear relatively calm and composed, with maybe a single tear, as soon as he saw the media, he would dramatically wail and show much more visible signs of grief. This performance only fueled the suspicions that something was not right with Jeremy. Jeremy's behavior at the funeral raised even more eyebrows. He was seen exaggerating his grief for the cameras, really hamming it up. But as soon as he was off camera, it was as if he snapped out of character, appearing far less emotional. Later that night, instead of mourning his family, Jeremy went out drinking. What struck people as odd was that he didn't mention his family at all during the night. Instead, he was seen having a good time, which seemed out of place given the circumstances. Throughout the evening, Jeremy made several offhand comments that further fueled suspicions. He reportedly made remarks suggesting that he was now in charge, with a tone that indicated he was pleased with the situation. His attitude seemed cocky and confident, as if he was content with being the sole heir to his family's estate. This behavior was unsettling to those around him and only added to the growing belief that Jeremy might have had something to do with the murders.